come once again to discuss things.
Alright. Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Geeky Gentleman History Month, the month in which we discuss the contributions that geeky gentlemen have made to history but that have been ignored by a biased educational system. I am Sid Part 2, except we don't do that at all. And I'm joined today by Ruben DeBoard, aka the Comics Kid 2099.
Hello.
Hello. So yes, this is our first discussion topic episode of Geeky Gentleman History Month, and I kind of piggybacked slightly off of something Ruben had talked about doing, but we kind of went back and forth and came up with something here. So we're going to talk about, this is going to be one of those episodes of Geeky Gentleman where we don't think of a title for the episode till 3/4 of the way through the thing, but we're going to talk very broadly about whether it is ever okay to admire someone historically. Because I find this to be infinitely fascinating. And just, I don't know, there's just a lot wrapped up in that idea.
Yeah.
So, you'd initially talked about approaching a topic of whether or not it's okay to like things historically that are problematic. What was the example you used?
Well, I was talking about how, in America, we've given Christopher Columbus his own holiday, and meanwhile we vilify Cortes, who basically did the same thing as Columbus. And nowadays, you'll see people every year around Columbus Day, they'll complain about Columbus, bringing disease and massacring the natives. And so people are not as okay with it as it seemed like they were when I was a kid. But, it still is weird to me that, Cortes, he's a bad guy, but Columbus gets his own holiday. And so that was kind of where it started. But I like that you're broadening it because it gives us more room to kind of branch out and talk about similar situations.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because it's not just we'd always treated Cortes as the bad guy and Columbus as the hero. Kind of infamously, Columbus, kind of lost a lot of his fame in his lifetime. He ended up being jailed by the Spanish court. Which not a lot of people know. Columbus also, to his dying day, determined, no, I found a part of India no one had ever found. That was his firm belief. He did not believe he discovered, quote unquote, discovered another continent. So Columbus actually lost his fame and stature during his lifetime, and Cortes was actually highly honored during his lifetime, and the people that journeyed with Cortes were highly honored. I don't recall the name off the top of my head, but one of the way Cortes conquered when he got to what's modern day Mexico is he joined forces with a lot of the lesser tribes and kingdoms that the Aztecs had conquered and had underfoot. And one of those tribes that Cortes joined with was either led by or was greatly assisted by a woman who was a Mayan, I want to say princess. A lot of the details are fuzzy on me on this one, so don't take anything I'm saying as solid, but I've got the general gist of it. But this woman was a Mayan princess, so she felt undignified living underneath the Aztecs, and so she helped Cortes and later converted to Christianity, and she was given sainthood for helping Cortes. So, like, one of the highest levels of honor in European society, fucking sainthood, was granted to someone. And so, like, not only just long-term historically, but, like, the short-term of how we look at people historically is kind of ridiculous. I'm pretty sure her sainthood has been revoked, but I don't know about that. Like, the short term has been can be quite traumatic, and then it can of course swing the other way with time. And so the idea of, like, can you admire someone historically is really interesting, because it also taps onto the idea of history's written by the winners, right? There's just a lot going on in that kind of notion, and I find it really, really fascinating.
Yeah, and I think, to answer the question, like, can you or should you admire people from history? I think it you have to take into account, like, what was going on in that time, and that doesn't excuse people from doing horrible things, but you can sometimes put into perspective, like, why they did things. That can certainly change how you look at someone. Like, if someone does something really horrible today and they did that exact same thing 200 years ago, today it would be looked down upon, whereas 200 years ago it might not have been a big issue at all. And so sometimes that's a factor. It might not be a big factor, but it can be one, I think.
I mean, like, even you go like 200 years ago, times change relatively quickly. If you just go back 50, 60 years ago, the idea of beating your wife was, like, looked down upon, but you weren't a bad person if you did it. Right. Like, beating your wife and children, like, it was looked down upon, but, like, people wouldn't say, oh no, he's just a piece of shit and he should have his children taken away from him back in the day. They'd be like, oh yeah, he beats up on them pretty bad, but, like, just the notions of how we judge people have changed dramatically. And I don't know, I see what you're saying. I definitely comprehend the thought process behind times change, and so the actions that someone was involved in historically change with them. So, like, I totally see the logic there. I just don't know if I buy it or if I just think it's a major cop-out.
I think it is a cop-out. I try to look at everyone equally and fairly. If someone does something horrible today and they did something horrible 200 years ago, I try my best to say, you know what, that person did something really horrible. It doesn't matter if society back then said that it was okay. Like, they still did something horrible. And, it's not even, like, something that happened a really long time ago. Like, just in the past, like, 50 years, like, times have changed. Like, the honeymooners made it seemed like it was okay for the main character to, like, threaten to beat his wife, like you were talking about, and that was in the 50s. Like, my parents were alive back then, so, like, that wasn't even that long ago. And so it's not just like, like we were talking about Cortes, that was, back in the 1600s. It's not even going back that far. It's just in the past, oh, sorry. See, I told you I don't know much about history. And just fine. Just going really recently, like, Elvis, didn't he have an underage? Like, didn't he marry an underage girl?
I don't think that's Elvis. I think that's Jerry Lee Lewis that you're thinking of.
Okay, yeah. So, like,
but I mean, also Charlie Chaplin.
Well, I didn't even know about Charlie Chaplin, and that's the great thing about history. It's like, you can find stuff out every day. Like, going off a little bit of a side rant, but yesterday I discovered that Alfred Hitchcock was apparently a really horrible person, and, like, played some really abusive, air quotes, pranks on some of his coworkers and, like, the actors he worked with on some of the movies he was on. Had no idea about that before yesterday. And I never claimed to be like an Alfred Hitchcock expert, but like that's just something that I've just discovered when I was just doodling around on the internet, and like that kind of thing to me, again, not that long ago, and that's not the kind of thing where you can say, well, society was different back then. Like that was in the 60s, and like no, it wasn't okay for directors to just treat their actors like garbage and do some things Alfred Hitchcock did. But it's interesting to me how you can, I don't want to say idolize, but you can look up to different people historically, and then you can find out that they weren't perfect, that they did have some flaws, and sometimes you can say, well, they had flaws, but they tried to work past it, and then sometimes you can say, oh wait, I really shouldn't be looking up to them.
The interesting thing about what you're saying, and my head's just buzzing with examples, so I must talk now. But like the interesting thing you're saying, to kind of contextualize it, is a lot of people will make some mental gymnastics to try to say some things. So I've sat in classes taught by, very leftist kind of people. I'll say liberal instead of leftist to be more precise in language there. But very liberal kind of people. And I've heard them say, yes, George Washington owned slaves, but he was a pretty good slave owner because he refused to break up families. And I'm just like, no, that sentence ends with, George Washington owned slaves. There's no but. There's no such thing as a good slave owner. That's an oxymoron. That he didn't break up families. Like, where are you setting? How low does the bar have to be for that to be the redeeming quality about the man, right? So yeah, I hear shit like that all the time. And what it is, I think, is it's people wanting to, or people having really positive emotions attached to this person and trying their best to justify having affection for them, even though they may have done things that are just absolutely reprehensible in the modern, not even in the modern context, because like it's always tempting to say, well, modern times we think this is wrong, but it wasn't seen as wrong back then. Like, no, it was. You know who knew slavery was wrong back when slavery was going on? The fucking slaves. They're people too. Their voices mattered. It's a really complicated thing. But at the same time, with that, I can understand having affection towards some of these historical figures. And so a character that comes to mind for me is someone who I think is incredibly complex, historically speaking. And that's Winston Churchill. Mm-hmm. Winston Churchill was an unapologetic racist and imperialist. Winston Churchill probably did more to start off the Cold War than anyone else. Winston Churchill was a man riddled with flaws, not just in that he was a bit of a drunk in society and all that stuff. That's whatever. But just deep flaws. Winston Churchill did more to try to stop Gandhi from establishing an independent India than anyone else. And you know what? Just while I'm on the subject, Gandhi, kind of an asshole too. The hot takes are coming tonight, folks. There's a lot going on there. But at the same time, Winston Churchill was a voice of strength that got the nation of the United Kingdom through literal hell of being bombed from the sky, thinking that death was coming around the corner. And so I can understand having affection for the man. And George Washington was a guy who made a great strive in a nation of democracy. Democracy for some, but democracy nonetheless. George Washington was a man who, at his core, was reasonably humble. George Washington did more to preserve the young American democracy than any of the other founding fathers. He was the one that set the precedent of a president, say that one 5 times fast, serving 2 terms and then stepping down. The idea of a world leader conceding power while they were still alive in a peaceful manner was fucking shocking for the time. It was unprecedented. So it's just like these things, there's things to objectively look at and go, that was good. But I don't think that it is right to excuse the bad in these historical figures in order to praise the good.
I agree. It reminds me of and this is probably like a good, I should just save this quote for the end of the podcast, but I'm going to go ahead and drop it now. There was a Superman comic I read where this kid, he looked up to Lex Luthor, and then through a complex series of actions, the kid's apartment burns down, and his family almost died, and he figures out that Luthor kind of knew about it. And then he's talking to Superman, and he says, I used to look up to this guy, and now, my whole worldview is falling apart. And Superman said, you can still, figure out what it was that you liked about Lex Luthor, and you can still admire those qualities even if you don't admire the man. You can try to be better, but you can still admire the things that you admired about him while acknowledging that there are flaws in him, and you shouldn't admire him on the whole. And I think that's a good thing to just take to heart in real life, and not just historically, but in the current day. I was when I found out about Alfred Hitchcock, I was scrolling through. It was a thread online about finding out certain people who did really horrible things that you might not know about. And it was I found out Michael Fassbender apparently was abusive to his girlfriend when he was first becoming a big actor. I didn't know that. And so now I look at him in an entirely different light than I did 2 days ago. But I think that's a really good, just kind of a way to just look at anyone, really. Not even celebrities or historical figures. It kind of reminds me of when we talked about the Selma, the movie Selma, and who I'm gonna kick myself for not remembering this. Who was the president at the time?
Johnson, Lyndon B. Johnson.
Yeah, and you were talking about how in the movie he's painted as an antagonist. He's trying to stop Martin Luther King Jr. from progressing with the civil rights movement. But you were talking about how in real life, Johnson, it wasn't all black and white. Johnson was very adamant. Someone had mentioned something about a child wearing rags, and you said and so Johnson wasn't just a mustache twirling bad guy. Ooh, I must be racist. There was more to him than that. And in the same manner, that movie was the first time I had ever heard about how Martin Luther King Jr. apparently had some extramarital infidelities that the FBI was trying to use against him, and I had talked about how that movie didn't quite explore him as a flawed human being like I wish it had. But that movie kind of is a really good. Anyone who wants a double dose of Geeky Gentleman, go listen to that video as a companion piece to this one. But I think it's a really good way of Martin Luther King Jr. is hailed as being a hero, and rightly so, because he moved the civil rights movement incredibly forward, him and other people at that time. But then he was just a man, and he did have flaws. And in the same way, Johnson appears to be kind of antagonistic and a very flawed figure, but then he had good sides also.
I mean, Johnson's an interesting historical figure too, because without him, the Vietnam War probably wouldn't have unfolded the way it did. So little column in the bad. At the same time, he was one of the few presidents who actually came from poverty and tried to do something about it. That is something to admire. But at the same time, he was doing it in a capitalist system, so it was kind of flawed to begin with. There's just it's complicated, and that's what I tend to think about this stuff is. I think that people are complicated, and that's the one thing about history that's never changed. like they just are. It's just really hard to wrap your head around some people. You know, like you can have literal mass murderers that do things that are just like incredibly impressive. Alexander the Great, you know, literally, like the dude is the definition of an imperialist. He wanted to conquer the world and damn well almost succeeded for the time. Like if he hadn't gotten bogged down in India and been able to conquer the whole thing, then turn up north toward the sea, and go through China, I don't necessarily know that there was any substantial military force in China that would have been able to take him down. Not that China didn't have an impressive military for the time period, but just, you know, with that much momentum behind the man, what can you do? But at the same time, it's just like when you look at Alexander the Great, he's just, you know, ultimately a person obsessed with himself, obsessed with the idea of conquering, and that's bad. Which is hard to think about in, you know, a Western context because conquering is romanticized so much in our culture. But it was bad. He was a bad person for, you know, conquering other nations, and I'm glad his empire fell apart. But at the same time, he had a tremendous respect for knowledge. You talk about things like the Great Library of Alexandria that he founded. And the whole point was to spread knowledge. He had a great respect and belief in the exchange of cultures, which was incredibly modern for his time. The fact that he immersed himself in Persian culture and encouraged cross-cultural marriages between his Greek and Macedonian soldiers and Persian women was not just a method of imploring genetic domination, which it was certainly, but it was a method of trying to mix and spread and normalize cultures to each other. The man was incredibly intelligent. So many stories about Alexander are so hard to tell fact from fiction, but they're interesting to note nonetheless. It was said that when there are all these cities all across the world of where Alexander's empire once laid, and they're all called Alexandria. And it was said that when he decided a city would be called Alexandria, he would be given some salt. Someone would follow him around with a big bag of salt, and he would pour it in his hands and pour the salt around a big barren area, and that would be the map for the city. He would map out the whole city. And, like, that's probably not true.
Right.
But it does speak to the character of the man and the appreciation for knowledge that he had. And that's a good thing. And he was a drunk, and that's a bad thing. And he was nice to Diogenes because he respected free thought and independence, and that's a good thing. And it's complicated. I would not be a good person for Alexander's jury. If Alexander the Great were put on trial and I had to sit on his jury, I'm not gonna be his friend. But damn if I would not be interested as hell in having fucking dinner with Alexander the Great, man. It's such an incredible contradiction in your head. I cannot help myself. You know? Yeah.
I'm trying to think of, like, there's so many historical figures where you look at what they do, it's like, that's really horrible, but also I'm really fascinated in what caused you to go in this direction. Like, I just want to pick your brain for an hour and figure out why.
Right? And so, like, that comes to the other side of the thing wherein it gets to a level where it's so wrong that it doesn't matter, right? Like, people have all these think pieces about Hitler and, like, what if he'd just gotten into art school or whatever. And you know what? sure, fine, maybe he did actually have some talent. I don't care. He was literally fucking Hitler. He is literally the worst person in history. There's just no getting around that. There are things that people try to make the case for that Hitler had objectively interesting things, and you know, fuck it, I'll do it. Hitler had a great appreciation for the arts in their ability to service his Nazi message and propaganda and domination of the world and destruction of the Jewish people. That's just the thing, is like, I know too much about him, so like maybe I could apply the same thing to Alexander, but I just don't know enough about him. Maybe he did have a deep respective knowledge in its ability to further his imperialist bullshit.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it went that far. I don't know if that was the reason. For some reason that I'm not even aware of. This is me kind of experiencing this live on recording. I don't know why I admire Alexander the Great's admiration for knowledge, because it is entirely possible, it is incredibly likely that he had an appreciation for knowledge because he understood its value from a military imperialistic standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
For some reason, I don't want to think that. And so I am willing to give him the benefit of the doubt that it was not solely for those purposes. I am not willing to give Hitler the benefit of the doubt on that. I know Hitler had a fascination with the arts and culture, but I also know that it was because he wanted to further them for propaganda for the Nazi machine.
Yeah.
And I'm not willing to give him that. You know, like, it's such a weird distinction, and I don't have an argument for it. It's just a thing that is in my head.
I could probably offer a justification. It would sound really weak, but like I would say, you know, Hitler was much more recent, and so those wounds, you know, are more fresh. Like, you know, Alexander the Great was what, like 3,000 years ago? Does that sound right?
No, Alexander the Great was Alexander the Great BC? Yes, Alexander the Great was so. BC. So yeah, 3,000 years sounds about right.
And so, like, that was a long time ago. Like you said, we don't even know some of the stuff about him, if it's true or not. But with Hitler, you know, there was people alive today who were alive then. And so we know a lot of the stuff about Hitler. We know it to be true. And so those things, it's easier to just say, yes, he's a monster. And, like, there's nothing admirable about him. I don't know. In 2,000 years, are people going to say, like, well, yes, Hitler did some bad things, but here's something good about him? I don't know.
Well, what's interesting is, of course, people try to whitewash it and say that now. Like, I talk about this all the time because it's something I hear, which is Hitler was a bad person, yes, but he did some incredible things for Germany. And what people mean by that, if you're being generous, is they talk about the social changes that were made, the big government works projects that turned Germany around from their depression that they were in. The most famous one that people go to is like the kind of the predecessor to the interstate in Germany.
The Autobahn.
Thank you.
Autobahn.
Yeah, people kind of go to that one as like, that was a hugely popular public works kind of thing. And so, like, people try to do that in some ways, and I feel it's nefariously, to justify Hitler's tactics. And what they fail to mention, what they neglect when they say stuff like that, is Germany was in a depression for a really long-ass time. Those projects were on the books. They were being worked on. Hitler was in power when they were finished. That's it. So, like, a lot of the stuff that, like, is seen as positive changes to Hitler, or positive changes to Germany during Hitler's reign, were things that were just already in progress because the nation wasn't fucking, like, unaware that it was in the middle of a depression. It was doing things to try to get out of it. It's just these things take time.
Yeah.
So it's really, really weird to try to think about and comprehend these things. So yeah, like 2,000 years from now, people might talk about Adolf Hitler and his reign and discuss, oh, well, yeah, he was evil, but like, look at these great things. And the context of what was being worked on at the time may have completely faded, and people might only associate the founding of the Autobahn with Hitler's early days in power, and forget that it was being worked on. And so, yeah, you're right. Maybe we don't remember, or maybe we don't focus on the awful things of Alexander because, well, one, he won. Like, he got turned back at the fucking eastmost shores of India. Yeah, or no, westmost shores of India. He basically conquered the fucking world as far as everyone was concerned by the time he got home. Interestingly, he could not convince his men to march any further. They were just fucking done with shit. And so he was like, all right, fine. And they erected a pillar marking how far they got. And the whole plan was to get to the sea, follow the sea back to the Nile, and come up the Nile and all this shit. So they erect a pillar where they stop in India and turn around and go home. And the pillar's like, just, it's something ridiculous, like 20 miles from the ocean. It's something like they were literally so fucking close to everything he wanted, and I kind of appreciate that that he got kind of fuck you right at the end. But yeah, like maybe the fact that it's just that he died victorious as far as his nation was concerned, that like we don't remember, we lose the context. He got credit for all the things that were good about his reign, even if half of them weren't that big a deal, even if half of them he had nothing to do with. Maybe I lack the context, and so I guess this just kind of turns into the reason why it's important to look at the full context of history, and hey, maybe not gloss over these things, these awful things that these people did that you happen to admire. Maybe it is important to actually remember some of the real details, because it adds context and it drastically changes the kind of person you're looking up to.
Yeah. And that's, like I said earlier, that's kind of true today also. Like, it doesn't have to just be people historically. Like, that can apply to people, you know, that are still alive today.
Yeah, I think so. Like, I think the interesting challenge of historically is people can change, but people can't change once they're dead.
Yeah.
You know?
That's a good quote.
Thank you. I'll put that down to my sayings. Yeah.
I was going to say, if we had, like, a quote, like, on a DVD box or something, that would be the quote on the back cover.
Damn, quotes from the philosophy of Ian Harrington. I've got a couple good ones. My favorite is Philosophy's Freddy Krueger, the bastard, nightmarish child of 1,000 madmen. But but anyway, so like the difference I feel in looking up to people today and looking up to people historically is, yeah, people can change, but they can't change once they're dead. Like Johnny Depp is an interesting case to talk about currently, because I grew up in the 2000s. I grew up liking a lot of Johnny Depp movies. I'm not like ashamed to admit I'm a fan of the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise. The movie Secret Window is actually, I think, a really good horror movie. There's a lot of Johnny Depp stuff I like. I legitimately liked Johnny Depp as an actor. I thought he was probably one of my top 10 actors. And I knew that he'd had some like shady past with trash in hotel rooms and stuff, but he was, from what I understood, he was younger and he kind of grew out of that and just matured. And so I was willing to look past that stuff. And then, came out that He abused his wife.
Yeah.
And yet they're still putting him in movies. Movies that, yeah, I'm gonna go watch them. And I'm gonna feel kind of bad about myself for watching them. But it's a really weird thing. And so I try to think to myself, Johnny Depp's still relatively young. He's in like his 40s, I want to say.
Maybe early 50s.
Yeah,
maybe.
okay. Can Johnny Depp change and become a person, a good person in my eyes again? Conceivably. I mean, it's that's the thing, is like, it's weird to think about this, the notion of being open to forgiveness, being open to second chances, because it's hard not to get played like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he's made some strides that I feel are pretty disingenuous and just a matter of trying to sway public opinion toward, you know, saying that he didn't, or that he felt bad about what happened, but what happened is being blown up in the gossip columns and stuff. I'm like, nah, I just don't believe that. That just seems disingenuous, and so I don't believe that was an actual apology, that he's actually making strides. But conceptually, can he? Yeah.
Yeah.
I could see Johnny Depp doing some things. He could withdraw from films for a couple years. No film appearances. He could produce a movie that, like, he has the funding. He could produce a movie that directly takes on issues surrounding domestic violence. It could be a documentary, it could be a fictional piece, and it could be an act of I want to use the word repression, and that's not it, but it's an R word. What? Recompense? Reconciliation?
Yeah, recompense is good. Or repentance. I know that's more
repentance. Yeah. That's the general idea of what I'm going for. He could take those steps, and I would legitimately find those. I would have a hard time arguing that those are not steps that are a net positive, that do, to some degree, redeem him in my eyes. I don't think he's going to do that, but the conceptual ability for him to do those things exists. Whereas Winston Churchill's dead, he can't not be racist. You know? Like, it's over for him. That's it. So, yeah, while we can talk about people are complicated and you can look at one side of them and everything, yeah, that does have context that can be applied to the living, but the living can still change one way or the other. Like, I really like Conan O'Brien. I think Conan O'Brien's a really cool dude, and I've seen some clips from him from, like, his 90s show where he says some stuff that's a little cringy now, but I kind of just recognize that was him at the time, and attitudes have changed, and I don't hear him say those things now. Like, I watched an old clip of Conan O'Brien from one of his, mid-90s episodes of Late Night, and he's like, oh, come on, that's retarded. And I'm like, ugh. But at the same time, when I was a fucking teenager, I used that every other word. It did not occur to me. I did not have the capability to realize at the time how offensive that was. I didn't. I'd heard it. I grew up hearing it. I still hear it today because I'm in kind of a, I'm in a more rural area. It's just something that people said and people still say. But you know what? Conan O'Brien doesn't say that anymore. Every time I've watched Conan O'Brien in, the last 5-10 years, he doesn't use that word anymore.
Right.
And I'm not sure if it's him, like, choosing to forgo that word from his vocabulary. I'm not sure if it's him trying to actively make a stand to be more positive towards people with mental disabilities, or if it's just the fact that the culture has changed and that word, more generally speaking, isn't as acceptable as it used to be. But I feel Conan O'Brien has changed with the time and is still a very admirable person. I don't want to find out tomorrow that Conan O'Brien's like an awful human being. And knowing my luck, I'm going to now. Right? Like, just anytime have you had the experience where you see a name on Twitter trending and you're like a celebrity name and you're like, oh no, they're either dead or they did something awful.
Exactly. Yeah, I was just thinking that. I was thinking, like, I don't know which. This is going to sound horrible, but I was going to say I don't know which is worse: finding out that they died, or finding out that they were involved in a sexually abused someone. I'm just like, I really you don't want someone to be dead, obviously, but and this is going to sound extremely selfish, but like. And we're kind of getting off the history thing, but that's okay. But like you don't want to find out that someone you admired has done something morally reprehensible. And it sounds bad saying that because it's like, they never did anything to me. Like, I really should feel bad for the person that they abuse. Like John Lasseter, the director of Toy Story, find out that he was using his position of power to kind of... what's the word I'm looking for? Like,
coerce
try and
sex.
put people... Yes, yeah. And so, like, that's really horrible. And I kind of just felt a little queasy and sick to my stomach when I found that out. But really, he didn't do jack to me. I should feel bad for the people that he abused. That's something I should be better about, and I try to be better about. But, like, that kind of thing, like finding out that someone that you once liked, oh, they did something horrible, and my gut reaction is always, well, I don't like that person anymore. And it's different for like historical people, like someone who lived 200 years ago, like, well, you take the good, you take the bad, there you have the facts of life. But like, yes, but like, I don't know, for some reason I have a way different reaction whenever it's someone today.
No, yeah, you're definitely onto something. Like, I feel like you're just expecting more negative from people who lived in the past, Because the past has always sucked. History's just a fucking minefield of suck. The sad reality is. Yeah, here's another one. The sad reality is this might be the best era of human history, and look around. Fuck.
That is really sad. Yeah.
Like, it's just... You expect it more. Like, you find out, oh, this person was a great thinker for the time. All right, so I like philosophy. I sign off as the philosopher every night. And you know what? Aristotle did some important shit for philosophy. Establishing logic. His work on poetics is really impressive. Aristotle also fancied himself a natural scientist. And he was a fucking idiot. Aristotle straight argued that being a woman was a birth defect.
Ugh.
Yeah, no, like, every child is like created in the womb with a penis, but if the cosmic winds do not blow the right way, then the penis will be blown off, and then you will be left with a fucking useless woman. That was basically his fucking argument. It's shockingly full of all the toxic masculine bullshit of the historical Greeks, of the ancient Greeks. That's just what it is. It's someone who was a great thinker in their time, who was incredibly influential to the course of Western history, was also steeped in the attitudes of their time. And so it's hard not to just accept that they're going to be kind of shitty elements to these people. And it's hard not to just say, all right, yeah, but like, look at this part. And I'm like, I'm right there with it. I so understand the desire to admire. Ooh, man, I am on it tonight. I understand that. But I still think there needs to be some part of you that pumps the brakes and spends more time not only acknowledging the bad, but deeply considering the bad. I don't know. It's really, really weird because I feel like you're dealing with two completely separate parts of the brain at that point. Or not the brain, the mind. Let me put it that way. You're dealing with the part that wants to, or you're dealing with this very emotional part that is undeniably impacted by these things these historical people did, that is making you admire them. You are undeniably impacted by the emotion of admiration. But then you've got this other part of your mind that's like very logical, very guarded, very concise, that is trying to look at the facts and the objective things about the life of this person that are wrong and that you know to be wrong. And so I do feel to be too admiring of someone is to like check a box and just have a cop out. It's a way to try to shut down and silence the more analytical side of your mind in order to just get wrapped up in the emotions. And I feel like the dangerous part of that is if you take the cop out and you keep doing that, if you keep taking the cop outs, it doesn't take long till you become one of the people who just straight start denying and admiring, even though there is a complete lack of any reason to admire. And that's where you start to get into some really weird, kind of creepy stuff. Like, you know, there is kind of a cult of personality around the founding fathers of the United States. Yeah, no, that shit needs to stop. Hamilton's a good musical, but yeah, no, we need to shut this shit down because there's too much admiration going on. There's not enough critical looking at the kinds of people they were and the kinds of things they were willing to allow. It's you can't have it anymore. It's just too much. You put them on such a pedestal that it's not just that we're not acknowledging their flaws, of which there are many. It's that we're straight ignoring them.
Yeah.
A year or so ago, there was the whole debate raging around about Confederate statues, and the argument from the like so-called center right for leaving the Confederate statues up was, well, what are we gonna do? Just start taking down statues of the founding fathers? They owned slaves, you know? I'm like, yes, we should. But it gets to this really weird place where you're just like, you're depending so hard on this cop out that you're willing to make statements like that. Like, no, that is an objectively good reason to not have a statue of this person. They own slaves. Goodbye, statues.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
It gets really complicated really fast because I do feel you're dealing with two different parts of your mind at that point. We got like another 10-15 minutes to fill here, but we are kind of circling around. I feel a lot of the same things. Can you take us somewhere, Ruben?
Well, where do you think that as a society, do you think we're getting better at this, or do you think it's, because you were saying earlier, like, sadly we're living in like the best era, like historically, like, do you think that we're getting better at saying like, okay, this person wasn't too great, like they did some pretty horrible things, or do you think we're still we have a lot more to do, like we still need more work on that?
I think the answer is yes. I think from my estimation, you know, guy on the internet, I know my opinion is so valid. From my estimation, yes, we are better about it. We're still not good enough. So we are better about it now than I feel we ever have been, because we're willing to be more critical now. Especially the last couple of years, we've been much more critical of these historical figures, and we've stopped at least so widely ignoring voices from history. You kind of have the great man history, and that, at least in the last 10 years, I feel like that's starting to fade away. I feel like there's been a better push, not just in history as an academic study, but in the wider culture around discussing historical figures. I feel there's been a bigger push to talk less about the great men of history and more about the peoples of history, the peoples that these big historical moments have affected, and what their impact was. So I feel like we've gotten better about it, but we still have a long way to go, because we're in this weird middle ground right now where we're willing to, behind the closed doors of a university classroom, we're willing to go into the ugly. But on the public streets, we erect statues to these people. That's not a pretty metaphor. That is literally the situation. We're willing behind closed doors to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. But we're not willing to effect that in the actual day-to-day. We're not willing to take down those statues. And in fact, there's a push to put more up. And I find that really interesting.
Do you think that people who are saying, like, no, let's keep the statues, there's, you have people say, like, if you ignore history or if you forget history, you're doomed to repeat it. Do you think these people are right or wrong? Do you think they're trying to go for a, we should not ignore our history even if it's an ugly history? Do you think they're trying to go for that, or do you think they're just, racist?
I'm not sure if it's, yes, they're racist, but not, explicitly so. I think they just have bought into the implicit racism of, particularly this nation's history. But more what I think it is it is an unwillingness to be truly critical of your history. It is an unwillingness to not only acknowledge but to accept and rectify your history. Because the example I tend to go to, and this is a nice example, a nice hypothetical, because it kind of covers a lot of things when we talk about history. So, I don't know how well your parents are to do, Ruben, but imagine that you were a reasonably wealthy family living in, let's say, a $300,000 home, 4 or 5 cars for the family to use, not exceptionally rich, not millionaire level, but doing really well, right? And then one day you come home and there are 50 police cars in your front yard and they're taking your dad away in handcuffs. And it comes out that the reason you guys were all doing so well was not because he had a really good job that paid him really well, but because he was robbing banks. Every cent of the money that was spent to give you guys the life of wealth and circumstance was literally stolen from other people.
Yeah.
That, for you, would absolutely suck, right? To discover that about your dad, that would be awful, and then, just everything about that would be nothing but a shock and would be, just horrendous, I am certain. I know that would suck, but at the same time, you don't get to keep all the stuff, right?
Right.
Yeah, you do have to lose the house. You do have to lose the things. There's no way around it. You don't get to keep all the stuff when literally every ounce of it was paid for with stolen money. And I tend to think of the same things a lot of times when we talk about these events. I use the same logic when we talk about these historical moments. So like you'll have every year I go to the Native Americans, and I feel like it's a cliche at this point, but you'll have people say like, oh yeah, what happened to the Native Americans was awful, their land was stolen and everything, but what are we gonna do about it now? Give them back the land. Well, we just can't do that. No, you just admitted you stole it. I don't care if it wasn't you that did it. You don't get to live on stolen land. That's the end of the argument. Give back the land.
Yeah.
And so those are the terms I tend to think of it in. So like when we talk about the statues, yeah, they regret the dirtiness of how those people, those quote unquote great men, got to their position in the world, got their ancestors, not only direct ancestors, but the ancestors of the peoples of their nation, got them to a position of pomp and circumstance and wealth. They regret the methods they used to get there. They still really like being where they are, and they don't want to have to lose that. And I feel like once you start taking down the statues, you've taken down the symbolism. You still have to take the steps to take down the to give back what was taken in the first place. You've removed the symbolism of like glorifying what was taken. Now it's time to actually deal with the reality of what was taken. And yeah, that's where I think that comes from with the statues. Is I feel like there's not even necessarily comprehended on a level, but I think subconsciously people know that if we take away the symbolism of the great man that gave us our nation, then we have to acknowledge the actual reason we got it, and then we have to probably do something about that too. So it's just easier to be morally inconsistent and live with the benefits.
Yeah.
At least that's my thinking on the matter.
Yeah, and it's, it's definitely easy for them to say, and I say them, I mean, we all are living on land that once belonged to a people that were displaced, hostily. And
genocided.
Yeah, there's a couple words that don't exist, hostily and genocided. Well, so it's easy to say, no, we can't do it, because it's like, well, then what happens to us? And so, like, but you're right, something has to be done.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's where, and it's interesting to wrap that up into the conversation of admiring, because you're going from something that is very personal to something that suddenly requires very direct action and contribution. And like, it's not to say that there aren't still arguments against it, because how far back do you go? Like, it is true that a point you'll hear these guys make a lot to try to justify this stuff, and it's not a bad point, but it's made in bad faith, I'll say that. It is true that just about every people have gone through subjugation to another people, and so on and so forth. So, like, yeah, the Native Americans were brutalized by European Americans, but you know what? The European Americans were brutalized and taken advantage of by the Europeans from which their ancestors fled. The fact of the matter is, the pilgrims that the Western Europeans that came to found North America as states and colonies and whatnot were fleeing religious persecution. So okay, well then, do they get recompense from Britain and the persecution they were fleeing? Well, to be fair, Britain got that way because it was recovering from persecution and enslavement under the Romans. Well, Roman got that way because they were under the Etruscans, and the Etruscans, not much is known about because their history was almost completely wiped out by the Romans. You know, like, how far back do you go with this shit before you start to, like, and yeah, it gets complicated because Italy is no longer the Roman Empire. So they can't, you cannot conceivably hold them accountable. You cannot ever hold Rome accountable. About the only true remnant of Rome is the Vatican, and that was, what, 3,000 years after the fact, before it was even established. It starts to get really weird and complicated when you talk about that stuff historically. But I feel like while that is not a bad argument, it is made in bad faith. That is an argument usually made as an excuse, not as a genuine plea for understanding and reason winning out.
Yes. And, you know, this is going to sound really cliche, but it's all like one big cycle, like you were saying. Like, you know, well, they did this because it was done to them, and they did it because it was done to them. And, like, fortunately, well, I was going to say, fortunately, that kind of thing isn't going on quite as much now. But I'm sure, like I said, 200 years from now, like, there's going to be people looking back at America in the early 21st century and saying, like, man, they did some really horrible stuff. And, like, they'll be paying for the consequences of what we as a society are doing now that we're not maybe too close to right now to notice what's going on.
Yeah, I see where you're coming from with that. I mean, I feel like I'm not too close to notice what's going wrong, but hey, maybe there's shit I don't even realize. Maybe I've said some horrifically offensive things, and people look back and like, he admired things about Alexander the Great? Well, didn't he know that once we used our time travel devices to go back and see, like, spy on Alexander the Great, just how horrible a person he was? I don't fucking know, man. I talked about it a little bit earlier, but it is important to add some context, which is you exist in a society that has its norms, has its rights and wrongs, and you can't always expect people to rise above those norms. There are always people who are ahead of their time, but you cannot expect everyone to be, by definition, ahead of their time. People are products of their age. So yes, Aristotle, again, for example, was very misogynistic, as just about every ancient Greek was. There were very few ancient Greeks that believed in the equality of women. Like, the entire philosophy of the time toward women was they're there to make babies and that's it. And they're not even the ones making the babies. Like, God. All right, so do you know what the Greek thinking on the process of baby making was?
I do not. I'm assuming it's horrible.
Well, men had babies in them because they plant the seed, and they can plant the seed wherever. Giving a woman a child is a gift to them from the man. So if a man wanted to shoot a seed into the ground, there's going to be a baby made from that ground. It's just not going to be as superior as a human child would be. So it's fucking crazy shit like that that people believed. They honestly believed it that way. They didn't. Their understanding of biology was very limited in that regard. So that's just how they thought of that shit. And so the idea that you need to treat women as equals because they are, it's so foreign to them, they wouldn't even know how to think of that. Like, they just, that was the product of their time. They cannot have the context to know what they did not know. It doesn't make it right. It is still very much wrong, but at a certain point, it's like, how harshly can you judge them given that they did not have the capability likely to ever comprehend what they didn't know about?
Yeah.
That was a really complicated. That one could have used much more finesse. I apologize. It's complicated shit though. This is why I love History Month. History Month is by far my favorite month of Geeky Gentlemen because I love talking about this kind of shit. It's complicated. Oh man. All right, so we are right about at the wrap up point. Did you have any final thoughts you wanted to conclude with, Ruben?
No, I think we kind of hit all the high points and middle points that we needed to hit for this one. I think it was a good discussion.
Did we ever decide on a title? Because can you look up to historical figures is a bit wordy.
Maybe like just admiration of history. I don't know, and like with a question mark.
No, that's too much about the subject. You need something about the people. Yeah, I don't know. Admiration of ancestors. Admiration of historical figures, question mark. It's going to have to be it. Oof, that's a fucking college course right there. And we just did it in an hour because we're the smartest people in history. Bam! Oh shit, I wiggled my mouse and made something weird happen. Yeah, alright, that'll do it. Everyone, thank you very much for watching. Until next time, I'm the Philosopher.
And I'm the Comics Kid 2099.
And we are your Geeky Gentlemen. And we will be discussing things historically.